Thank you everyone for being here. Always honored to be in community on this campus. I am Abdo, I'm an organizer with No Agenda for Apartheid, and lucky moderator for this conversation with Dr. Zahzah. A little bit about Dr. Zahzah for people who might not know. Dr. Zahzah is a writer, journalist, poet, also an assistant professor of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies in the Department of Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State. Dr. Zahzah's background, or academic background, and research focuses on Black and Palestinian/Arab American literary solidarity and co-resistance to racial surveillance and policing, while his pedagogy centers upon Arab and Arab American studies, including Palestine within an ethnic studies framework. Today, I'm lucky to welcome Dr. Zahzah to this conversation where we'll talk about digital settler colonialism. What does that even mean? So give it up for Dr. Zahzah.
Thank you so much, and I want to just start out that thank you, Abdo, and thank you to all the organizers for making this possible. I just want to emphasize it's really an honor to be here with you tonight and having a conversation about these very urgent issues.
Likewise. I was chatting with Dr. Zahzah before we started about when was my first time hearing about the term digital settler colonialism and how it was a core memory for me. And I think, in terms of Servitude and the articles you shared before then, you talk about digital settler colonialism, and for someone who might be hearing that term for the very first time, how would you go about defining it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, very quickly for those who may not know, I wrote a book, it was published last year, September 2025, called Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. And so digital settler colonialism, as I talk about it in the book, I'm not the first person to use that term. It refers to the ways that digital spaces and digital platforms reinforce systems and practices of settler colonialism. Basically, how is digital technology weaponized in a way to reflect the physical dispossession that indigenous peoples all over the world continue to face. But in the book, I applied that term to think about the Palestinian context specifically, and I used it as a way of moving beyond the apartheid framework, because in my earlier work, I had talked about the experiences of digital repression. I was primarily looking at a lot of social media because I was coming out of the 2021 Sheikh Jarrah moment where you had all of these viral posts about Palestine that seemed to be really affecting kind of a narrative shift in a broader cultural sense. And then all of a sudden, you started to see a lot of those creators, getting banned or getting their posts deleted. And so in 2021, 2022, I looked at that and I thought, well, this is apartheid because the digital technologies are reflecting the physical apartheid system that the Israeli state has in place. But then later on, I started to realize that actually, even apartheid in and of itself is one aspect of a broader system of control and dispossession, which is settler colonialism. Zionism is a settler colonial project. Israel is a settler colonial state founded upon the dispossession, the ethnic cleansing, and ultimately the genocide of the indigenous population. And so I realized that it's really important to focus on what are the different ways in which the weaponization of digital technologies and the oppressive actions of big tech fortify that broader project of settler colonialism. Everything comes back to settler colonialism. And so when we think about digital settler colonialism, as I'm exploring it, in my writings and in the book, it's really just to think about how do digital spaces fulfill that ultimate mandate of completely dispossessing Palestinians. Physically, that looks like driving them off the land. It looks like genocide. It looks like the discriminatory laws that you have in Palestine, the 48 territories. But in digital spaces, it often looks like, making sure that they're completely excised, given no presence, making sure that, any reference to Palestine is more and more deleted from the digital sphere so that it reflects the physical process of total expulsion. So that's how I really started thinking about it. And of course, we do need to include the military applications of AI, right? Things like, the programs like Lavender, Where's Daddy, The Gospel. But in the book, I also really wanted to focus a lot on social media because I felt that a lot of times it's something we can take for granted, because it's something that's so entrenched in our everyday lives and our working lives. So even as I didn't want to lose sight of the kind of directly militaristic applications, I also wanted to think about how are the censorship examples that we see via these big platforms also a reflection of not just oppression, but specifically of settler colonialism in action. So I would say really, when we think of digital settler colonialism, it's thinking about what are all the ways that digital platforms and technologies reinforce a broader settler colonial project. And this should also be emphasized with the direct and willing complicity of the big tech industry. Because I'm sure and I'm sure others in groups like No Tech for Apartheid or who work on campaigns know, these companies are very willingly partnering with the Israeli state to do these things. So I also wanted to make sure that the term works in the sense of reflecting that this is an active collaboration happening on the part of two very powerful and oppressive actors kind of working hand in glove to continue to facilitate this process of dispossession, for the furtherance of their bottom line and the realization of their political goals.
Yeah, I think like this kind of framing and understanding of like these technologies and No Agent for Apartheid is a campaign of Microsoft workers who are trying to force Microsoft to cut its like cloud and AI contracts with the Israeli military and government. And like a lot of what we think about is like when we go to our coworkers and we tell them about like, hey, this is how Microsoft is selling this technology, like we get this act of like, no, but I work on apolitical code. I work on just making the machine run faster, run more efficient, store more data, and like there is a loss of sight of like how this technology becomes what often is called like dual-use technology, like a technology that can cause harm, technology that can cause genocide, and like we speak of the first AI-powered genocide. And I think that's honestly like a really important piece that I wanted to touch upon because like I think you start with or you go back to like 2021 and what happened with Sheikh Jarrah and like the moment, the Unity Intifada, right? But in 2026, sort of the landscape is both the same and different in a lot of different ways. And I would love to kind of, if you were to think about what is different in 2026, 5 years after Sheikh Jarrah, how do these sort of paradigms or methods look different now?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's funny because a lot of times when I talk about, having worked on the book and doing this work, it feels like it's an outgrowth of two different moments because I started really working, at the kind of the tail end of 2022, I believe. And so, there was still this sense, we were just coming off of the Unity Intifada. So there was still this sense that even though there's all of this tech repression and it's very entrenched and it's growing, that also it felt like there was a kind of shift that was palpable. And I realize now that was probably a little bit idealistic, but nevertheless, I do think that there's something to seeing 2021, and even though there was still so much oppression that was happening, it was a different tenor than what you start to get, obviously with, October 7th, 2023, when you have the latest genocide in Gaza beginning, right? And so a lot changed, I think, obviously just politically, circumstantially, right? Where you have, on the one hand, the ongoing reflections of daily life under settler colonialism, which does include, these sudden expulsions that can happen, or these decisions to expel that are very routine, actually. That was one of the standout things about 2021, was things that often routinely happen were kind of put under the spotlight, and all of a sudden, it became a galvanizing thing. But normally, this is just par for the course, right? So there's a distinction between that, seeing this increasing prominence of Palestinian perspectives and voices, which it should be said that, had used their own creativity really to bring about this wedge in the narrative, right? They used social media in these savvy ways. They used legacy media, or corporate media in these savvy ways, right? They took these invitations to speak and redirected the script, right? One of the things I talk about in the book is a lot of us, I think, will remember that clip with Hassan Kanafani where he's talking to Richard Carleton in 1970. That interview was Carlton asks him, why won't you engage in peace talks with the Israelis? And Kanafani says, you don't mean peace talk exactly, you mean capitulation, surrender, right? It's like, what's the point of talking? What is talking going to serve? So I talked about how, Palestinians have always used media in this savvy way as part of this ongoing liberation struggle, used sites that were not made for them, but were actually made to exclude them, and had, out of necessity, to develop these skills of really maneuvering media in these very intentional ways to kind of flip the script on its head. So 2021, I think in many ways was about that. We were seeing that in action and playing out in real time. So even as the repression started, it seemed like there was a palpable shift that had been made because so many of these perspectives and these tactics were, actually happening before our very eyes. Then you have the genocide and you come into the present moment now. One of the main differences I would say is that I think a lot of what seemed so exceptional at the time, like this mass censorship, I think has become very standardized. And I think because we're in this kind of just this very global fascistic moment, really, I think that that's really emboldened a lot of these actors even more, to very blatantly kind of lean into these tactics of saying, you know what, we have the right to ban these, voices from our platform. This is our platform. This is we're private companies. We do whatever we want. If you don't like it, you can go somewhere else and let somebody else steal your data, right? So I think that there's an emboldening now and a streamlining of, what in the beginning had seemed like it was kind of an excess and that was going to be counteracted in some way. So that's, one of the main things. And the other, I would say, is just, the sheer materiality of the genocide itself. I think a lot of tech companies are very deeply entrenched in it. One of the things I always come back to is the report by Francesca Albanese that talked about how big tech as an industry is just directly complicit with colonialism and genocide, so that globally the response needs to be to start to find new creative legal ways to actually hold these institutions and the people behind them accountable. So now I think 2026, it's kind of like we're in this mask off moment where the writing is completely on the wall, but we don't really have a point of leverage, to actually stop these things, at least in the usual paths, because all of these companies have very effectively insulated themselves for the most part.
No, I think hearing that, like, I definitely agree on this, like, moment of, like, the Palestinian creativity, like, the people who chose to, like, witness the genocide and tell people about the genocide and, like, put their lives at risk, right? And kind of create this moment where every day you are waiting for someone like Bisan to say, like, hey, this is day however many of the genocide and I'm still alive, and like that resonating with a lot of people, despite like the fact that this is not Bisan's first language, right? Like this is Bisan going through a genocide and telling people about what's going on. And then the second piece, and I'll come to that piece because I have questions specifically about it. But the second piece they talk about is this big tech company, right? I think in 2021, Google and Amazon had signed a $1.2 billion contract, $1.2 billion contract with the Israeli military and government called Project Nimbus. Highly recommend people look into that, right? And you see the reporting that came out of it, in the years after of they signed the contract knowing that there will be human rights violation, knowing what the technology will be used. And similarly, Microsoft also in 2021, I think the Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, met with the head of the Unit 8200, that's the Israeli spy agency, and basically was like, you know what, let me store every call and text that comes out of Palestine on Microsoft servers, right? And the response was not oh, is surveillance bad? The response from the CEO was actually, this is a powerful brand moment. This is a partnership that we want to do. And then you get to the point that you're talking about where Meta, under the guise of moderation standards or community guidelines, right, are brazenly and systematically removing Palestinian content or silencing Palestinian voices. And I guess I want to understand how do we understand what these companies are doing right now? I think Google for the longest were oh, we do no evil, or Microsoft was I have an office at the UN, so I'm definitely on the good side. Or Meta is we are trying to connect the world. But right now in 2026, they are more brazenly engaging in this digital settler-colonialism. So like, how do we understand this moment and how this shift and how these big companies are being more acting with impunity, I guess?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that they, these companies over the years, and I mean this was a process that had been in the works for many years, right? But they basically amassed so much power and so much impunity, in various ways. One of them is really becoming the main source of providing a particular product that just has come to be the only one that we use, right? So they have this supremacy in that sense, and that allows them to really act with a lot of impunity, right? Because they know ultimately, Google knows that you're probably going to be not going to be finding a different service, right? Because they rely a lot on things like the network effect, for their search engines. They have so many products that, build themselves on being very usable, but are also very masterful at extracting so much data. So, they kind of have amassed basically this cultural sort of dominance that I think allows them to act with this impunity in many ways. And so, I think that really sets us up to get to a moment where you can have companies then say, well, now not now because they had always been doing it, but I think they can be more open about now going to working in the laboratory of, a colonial site, like Palestine or like Gaza specifically, or like looking at the West Bank. How do we look at or help collaborate with, surveillance technologies and tactics? How do we look at, refinements in military-grade weaponry, knowing that the things that they develop, are not just going to stay in Palestine, because that's part of the point. They're developing their own sophistication and expertise in developing these products that can then be exported, that can then be used by other repressive forces. So I think a lot of the conversations that organizers are having now are precisely about how a lot of the surveillance tactics that have been honed, let's say honed collaboratively, because I think it's always been kind of a boomerang, but what you see really refined in Palestine also comes back vis-a-vis companies that are surveilling protesters in the United States now. So when you have things like the emboldening of ICE in this way, where they, just continue to slaughter with impunity, and people who protest against that are surveilled, by companies that have the very same investments in Palestine, we're seeing this, circle shrink in many, many ways. So I think it's really that the cultural supremacy and dominance they've come to have has also kind of translated itself into a kind of political impunity. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the collusion of a lot of political regimes that, for the most part are pretty happy, to work with big tech. I mean, I think not many people were surprised when, for example, we see the second Trump administration, we see how the industry reacts, which is, giving him gifts of gold and all of this stuff, because they know basically now we can really go completely mask off and pursue the practices we've always wanted to pursue, which for all of the branding they used to use, particularly in the 2010s, are not really about empowering people or enabling democracy, right? It's about control and extraction of data. And if you have a client who's going to say, well, I want to refine surveillance to make sure that we can really crack down on people who are showing too much dissent or who are making it a little bit, more difficult for us to do our business, which is what protest is supposed to be about, right? Then they're not going to have any qualms about going to that client, and we're seeing that play out in real time. So I just think it's various forms of cultural supremacy that have translated into this kind of political impunity.
Yeah, I think when you sort of think about the parallels of and I think this there's a concept of the Palestine laboratory, or like the technology that gets developed and tested in Palestine ends up making it out of Palestine. And I think a lot of the reporting that is coming out recently around surveillance technology of oh, you are able to look through people's social media really quickly with AI here in the United States. They're oh, that has been happening in Palestine because they have been monitoring the social media of Palestinians in the West Bank, right? You have people that are oh, you can now predict a person with a score, how often they're going to be at their home or something like that. That is by definition, or not by definition, but the mix of the lavender gospel and Where's Daddy, where they are able to find how likely the person is to be targeted. That there's a target bank that gets developed, and detect if they are at home, so that you're able to target them. The same technology gets kind of weaponized in very different ways here in the United States. I'm gonna pivot a little bit to kind of focus on internet and social media, and I think one of the things that like you speak at length about in terms of servitude is like how the Palestinians have used the internet and social media to kind of own their narrative. But at the same time, like you speak at length also of like how Palestinians and Palestinian voices have always been like censored, erased, harassed, attempt to be eliminated in a way. And I guess like in your experience as a student once, an organizer, academic, like how have you been kind of navigating that contradictory capacity, and how have you seen Palestinians in Palestine navigate that contradictory capacity?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to just realizing that Palestinians, have always been, the point has always been to erase Palestine and Palestinians. And this was very much the case for what we refer to as the legacy media, so basically like broadcast media or, the large-scale newspapers, like the New York Times, I think, people. But basically, so, there had always been this really intense narrative embargo around Palestine in legacy media. And at large, culture, at large, you had always seen this stream of just constant demonization and misrepresentation of Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians. And a lot of this really stemmed from after 1967, when you have this real entrenchment. Of course, the U.S. had supported Israel prior to this, but in '67, you really have the entrenchment of this military-imperial relationship, and the U.S. as this kind of hegemonic power leading into Israel as its proxy state in many ways. And that, of course, translates into further cultural dehumanization, right? So in many ways, to be tied to endeavors related to the crafting and dissemination of narrative and the changing of knowledge, whether it's academia or whether it's journalism or whether it's even different forms of literature, on some level you're always connected to this phenomenon whereby that the dominant institutions, right, are really predicated upon the erasure of Palestinians. And so there's always been this sense that what you're doing, if you're trying to work within those spaces, is that you need to kind of subvert that, right? And so you need to tell a story that was never supposed to be told. And I think for years, Palestinians have really been experts at doing this. I mentioned Ghassan Kanafani, who had done, his media work in addition to being a brilliant writer. There were people like Edward Said, for example, who, I come back often to his phrase, permission to narrate, right, where he talks literally about the issue being that there's a lot of information and reporting about Palestine, but there's never any, inclusion of Palestinians, because the idea is precisely to deprive them of the permission to narrate, whereas, you have this overemphasis on Israel, and Israelis and Zionism. And of course, this is because the US media, as a dominant industry, has always relied on promoting imperial causes, right, whether directly or covertly through things like who is included and who is not included. So I think in many ways you realize that the cultural apparatus, if I can use that term, especially the dominant cultural apparatus, is always very much against Palestine and Palestinians have always worked in spite of that. And, so part of working on the book was coming to the realization that even though when you look at tech, you're talking about a new industry, right? But some of the dynamics are not new, right? So what Palestinians were able to do and remain able to do in many ways was to use these new ascendant platforms to talk about their struggle in a way that, can spread to many different people, when, the whole intent of the Israeli project and the complicit kind of mainstream media industry was always to make sure that they were completely erased. So they used social media to kind of create this wedge, and to spread awareness of their situation. And so part of what I saw, through talking to individuals in the book, was I talked to Palestinians who described to me how in Gaza and the 2010s in particular, they started to really turn to Twitter, and Twitter was an intentional choice aside from Facebook, which they were already recognizing had been very censorious and would often close accounts for no explanation and things like that. And what they told me was that part of their sense of how to navigate social media and make things like Gaza under attack trend more and more stemmed directly also from their classes and their work on narrative, right? Because I was talking to a generation of individuals who had been colleagues and comrades in many ways with the great late Palestinian intellectual and teacher and poet Rifat al-Hariri from Gaza, and many of them were his students. And what they said basically is, part of how al-Hariri approached his own media work, and really any of his work, was through an understanding of the power of narrative. Because there's a way to tell a story, and there's a way to tell a story in a way where people understand the universal application of the struggle that they're hearing about. And so he understood that the power of narrative is precisely that it could allow the Palestinian struggle to spread, in contexts where it would otherwise be, forced into obscurity. And it was why he spent so much time training generations of young writers and bloggers. And so what people told me was, when we were using social media, we were basically using these skills through social media. And so in many ways, they figured things out, like how do we make things trend, right? How many posts does it take, on a topic to get it to trend? And so they were telling me about particular attacks. Well, we realized we needed 100 people. So we have 100 people posting, but we do them in a way where, there's something to where people see them and want to spread them and want to share it. And so I think right now, a lot of what I see is, we talk about the newfound awareness in Palestine as a result of the genocide, which I think is very much true. But also there's another aspect to it, which is that Palestinians, have been working for years, in these grassroots initiatives and efforts. And so the shifts that we see that seem sudden have actually been the process of years and years of work.
Like, this is honestly like such a perfect moment to kind of like reflect on the work that Dr. Rifat al-Hariri had done, Allah yarhamu, like 10 years ago or so, or even longer, and like how it is manifesting in like giving Palestinians this autonomy to narrate their own experience, right? And I think actually one of the things that when I was reading the book, and like I think it was an interview you did with Osman Nabi, who is, I believe, like the Gaza municipality spokesperson. So he's someone who is aware of how to talk about Gaza in a narrative way. He was talking about like how when Rifat al-Hariri, when he was thinking about Gaza Writes Back, and this is really early on, like before like social media became popular, how about contextualizing like what happened in Operation Cast Lead in 2008, not as sort of an outlier, but like as something that follows years and years from as early as the militia attacks on Palestinian villages pre-1948. And I think you speak this moment about like how what we are seeing right now is actually not an outlier, but rather as something that has been happening and has been in the work in this broader context of the anti-colonial struggle in Palestine. And I think maybe what I would want to ask is like, in viewing this moment, I think you talk about the raised awareness global-wide. A lot of people are thinking about Palestine, a lot of people are taking action for Palestine, but at the same time, we're seeing the same imperial powers. Like, I think I wrote this question like a week ago, and I needed to change it today because like, I don't know if people have seen like the Board of Peace and like this economic plan for Gaza at the World Economic Forum, but also we see the Zionist intense focus on like, let's control Meta, let's control Twitter, let's take over TikTok, which I think the sale is going to Larry Ellison in a couple of days. So it's a long-winded way of like asking the question, right? How do we understand this moment in this broader context and think about what we should be doing now to set up for, I don't know, a few years down the line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think right now, what's happening is that I think we're seeing that the powers that be on various levels, are being increasingly called out and criticized. But at the same time, because of this total impunity, they don't necessarily see a need to change their actions. And they, it's kind of the emboldening that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So I kind of think of this moment as, in many ways, the illusion of hegemony, right, which is this attempt to just present a view of the world that is most beneficial for those in power to have you believe. So usually there's an attempt to manufacture consent or make people think things like, Israel really is this great democratic bastion that's just fighting terrorism. I think the illusion of hegemony in many ways has fallen, I think. And yet we're at this moment where, there is still actually the machinery of the power behind the hegemony, and it doesn't see a need to change. So we're in this moment where there's far less illusions, and yet, the actual institutions and regimes are emboldened to continue to do things, right? No matter, to a certain extent, the outcry or the sentiment yet, right? And yet I think for all of that, what we need to continue to do is to push back even more and to continue to find new and innovative ways of exerting pressure, right? And that's why I think one of the things I talk about in the final section is, fighting back, basically. So different examples of resistance. And so I think, examples like, No Assur for apartheid, right, or No Tech for apartheid. Initiatives like this are really important because it's basically hitting a lot of these companies where it hurts, which is literally, their labor power, right? So if the workers say we're not going to do this and we're actually going to sabotage this and we're actually going to engage in these demonstrations, they may still continue doing the same things, but you're making it more difficult to continue to do that, right? And you're spreading more and more kind of massive outcry. I think we need to continue to resist and find ways of resisting. Because if we give in to despair or defeatism, to a certain extent, we're already doing the work of the oppressor because they want us to think that we can't do anything, we can't change anything. So we'll literally just make it easier for them, right? I don't think you necessarily resist because you know you're going to win. You resist because you believe you have to, and because you believe another world is necessary, right? And so in that sense, resistance really is about this kind of militant optimism, and I think it's important to continue to cultivate that, even when the asymmetries of power are so stark, right?
Yeah. No, I think I'm trying to remember what the quote was like. If you don't do anything, nothing will change. But if you do something, something might change. And I think you're right. I think there is still an urgency in the moment, right? There is an ongoing genocide under a so-called ceasefire, right? The ethnic cleansing that's happening in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is still ongoing. There is an urgency in the moment. There is a fight to be had here for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, everywhere we go. And I think we are honestly very well positioned. You speak of the tech workers who are at Microsoft, Google, and Amazon taking this action, but no, actually here in our community, right, we are in the belly of the beast, the United States, the head of the imperial power. But also we are near Silicon Valley, as near as it can get. These companies are in our backyards. And I think one of the questions that maybe would love to hear your perspective on is what are these ways of resisting and organizing that students at Berkeley who are maybe in STEM and are going to be working at these companies down the line can take? Maybe lessons for me as a worker in the tech industry, but also for our community who live very close and are in the back. These companies are in our backyard.
Yeah. I think there's several things you can do. One thing, just by virtue of being here, obviously, right? This is the heart of the tech enterprise in many ways. So I think these companies are looking to you in various ways to, perhaps you'll become the new labor elite, or even if there's kind of a downturn in labor, I think they're still really looking for your buy-in, as workers, as students, as individuals on various levels. And because universities and this area in general is so rife for different tech ventures, one thing you can do is you can look into what are the different ways in which my institution or even my other places that I frequent may be entrenched in various reprehensible, basically, tech companies, right? So, for example, I work at San Francisco State right now. The CSU system as a whole signed this $17 million deal with OpenAI to basically force AI upon all of the campuses, and this is not something that anybody was consulted about. So we're trying to think of ways to basically mount pushback against that, right? But what are the different ways your institutions are directly complicit, right? Because what we've seen, I think, if you look at the the moments of the student intifada all the way to the present, I think what it demonstrated was that universities are in many ways very much willingly complicit in a lot of these systems. I think it's really important when people in universities continue to push back, but I also think that sometimes the framing of capitulation is not totally accurate, because I think universities are very active collaborators, because they don't ultimately want a system where people are advocating for anti-colonial liberation, right? They'd rather have a system that just continues to produce good workers who pay a lot of money for tuition and who are going to go on to make new $1 million industries that will continue to have partnerships. So basically, they're treating it as this as this investment portfolio, right? And you are kind of these piggy banks that they can continue to pull from. That's the vision they have. And so in many ways, the university has always been disincentivized against protest and dissent. So I think part of it is really continuing to follow the trail to see, like, okay, what are the different companies that universities are invested in, right? What are the ways that they're partnering with different forms of dispossession and oppression, including, of course, settler-colonialism and the occupation when it comes to Palestine, but other companies that, are perhaps straddling multiple tiers of oppression. And then thinking about also, how do you continue to push back against this social vision that a lot of the elites, I think, have for the youth, which is basically to go into, I think at some point it was really to go into these industries and continue to be, good workers for them. Now I think it's becoming a little bit more dystopian, because we've seen these companies also engage in these massive layoffs and just say that they're, so it's getting a little more dire, but still, like, what are the ways that you continue to push back against the social vision that people have for you, right? And how do you continue to just pull out the complicity in different systems and forces of oppression wherever you are? I think continuing to think of that actively and to get involved in organizations that are working on these things, especially now. I think there's a lot of negative things of being where we are, but one of the advantages, I think, to being on a space like this is there are many organizations that you can plug into at least. So, what are Bears for Palestine doing? What is the East Bay YDSA doing? Noah Zor for Apartheid, what are they doing? Finding the organizations that are doing the work that you care about, that you can get involved in, and find ways to fight back both globally and locally.
Yeah, and I kind of 100% agree, right? Like, there are a lot of people kind of fighting this fight that is on multiple fronts, right? We talk about the divestment campaigns within universities, we talk about the worker campaigns within these companies, we talk about the community. Like, I know there is a lot of work, for example, trying to deflock, right, here on this side of the bay, right? And there's an important fight that is a representative of the global fight against sort of surveillance, right? It's surveillance technology that has been used to kind of erase Palestinians, have been used to continuously displace them, right? It is the same surveillance technology, just under a different name, and it's the same surveillance technology that will get used eventually against our community here by the likes of ICE and eventually other sort of enforcement, whatever you want to call it, down the line. I think, yeah, like I always think about, he's not here with us today, but Perrin Cow, the lecturer who was here and went on spoke at early on in the genocide at one of the lectures, trying to dismantle the social vision of, like, hey, class is done, you're in the classroom, but reality, this is the technology that I'm teaching, how it's being weaponized in this Gaza genocide, and later on, going on a hunger strike and bringing attention to UC Berkeley complicity in this bigger system of oppression. And we have an organization that's up and coming with STEM for Palestine, of like students who recognize that how STEM technology or these sciences have been used to enable settler-colonialism, enable the product of Zionism, right? It's not just like, oh, if Google is the one doing it, then everybody is okay, right? No, Google collaborates with UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley in and of itself, right, is an active collaborator. I got a chance to ask a lot of the questions I had in mind. I could sit here and ask questions for hours, but I would love to hear from the audience questions that came up for y'all throughout, and yeah, continue this conversation as a broader group.
I'm wondering to what extent I'm going to scope out a little bit from what you said, and I'm wondering to what extent are you aware that in many parts of this country, especially when you get away from the prominent universities, there's a big lack of knowledge about Palestine. I think many people, some in certain neighborhoods, even in the Bay Area, wouldn't know what Zionism is. Many people in other parts of the country, many parts of the country, wouldn't know that Palestinians are the indigenous people. The Zionists got a lot of mileage out of the phrase, a land without a people, or people without a land, neither one of which was true. But they've gotten a lot of mileage out of that. And so I'm one of the OGs in the pro-Palestinian movement. I think I was in the original SJP here at UC Berkeley. And in my own activism, I really specialized in media. I found that a lot of Palestinians, a lot of American Palestinians, when they do get a chance to speak in the mainstream media, to me have seemed like a total lack of awareness of what people don't know. And so they get involved in esoteric debates with the Zionist who's merely labeled as a Mideast expert, like the late Martin Endick, if you know him, or Dennis Ross, people like that. So I'm just wondering to what extent you considered that, because that's been one of the primary ways that I've been active in the media, on television, and in radio, and in numerous commentaries I've written over the years, to just sort of drop in that, Palestinians are the indigenous people. The majority of Jews came from Europe, right? And what Zionism is. I happened to mention that once at a lecture here at UC Berkeley. And there was this older white activist who came up to me, and a younger person, I don't know whether they were an activist or just tending to learn more, who both thanked me for saying what Zionism was. I don't know of a single Palestinian American professor who's ever been aware of that or has done that.
Well, thank you for all of your work. I would just say that I think that continuing to do education needs to continue to be an important part of all of our organizing. And I certainly think it's true. Part of what's been happening for many decades is there has been this intensive media, I guess you could say this monopolization of the Zionist perspective, which I think, obviously is part of how the media industry in the Western countries, in the United States in particular, works. It's to prop up imperialism, all of which is to say, I definitely think it's true. We've had decades and decades of misinformation. And so I do think that it is important to continue to do things like teach-ins or different forms of educating. I think we need to, be able to engage on multiple levels, and depending on the context of the conversation, but I certainly don't think we should lose sight of the fact that we need to continue to have Palestine 101s. I think that that's actually one of the most important things that SJPs do. And I think it's still great that they still have that in their roster all of these years later. But I do think that there is, and it seems to me, that there is more receptivity now to reconsidering things that we may have seen in previous years, which I think is all the more reason to lean in even more on this aspect of doing more public education and really making sure that we're presenting things in a way that's actually digestible to people. Because what you were describing too about getting into these esoteric debates, I also think that that's just also a strategy of trying to deter impactful public education. You can have people on the opposition come in and just ask, what about this charter in this year? And then people just get into that tangent instead of saying, the real issue is XYZ. You can't explain to me why we've justified these people facing these policies all of this time. That's what the focus needs to be. So it's a combination of focusing on public education and I think also this intentional usage of media, which is always a work in progress, but the more of us that continue to do it, the more impactful it will be for the movement, I think.
I just wanted to add something. I know you know who Rashid Khalidi is,
Yeah.
but for those who don't know, he's a Palestinian American professor at Columbia University. I mean, he probably more than any other Palestinian American would actually get into the national media, usually on PBS, right? And he was as guilty of this as I've seen, including Edward Said, I have to say, was as guilty of this as any other Palestinian American I've seen. And the Zionists, again, who would not be even noted as Jewish, let alone as an Israel lobby official, would just be called a Mideast expert. And I've seen it over and over again. Their tactic is to draw the Palestinian into some esoteric debate, including Rashid Khalidi and others. And to me, there's been a certain lack of street wit among Palestinian Americans who aren't, I mean, you know, there are places like Berkeley, so they think everybody knows all this stuff, right? But who aren't aware of what the general public may not be aware of. And I used to wear a kaviyah around all the time. And there is this, people understand that something's wrong,
Right.
but they don't know what's wrong. And when I used to wear a kafia, especially as a Black American, all kinds of people would just come up to me and be really inquisitive about it. Like, you know, what's that you're wearing? And they kind of vaguely know it's pro-Palestinian. And can you tell me about this? So even in American TV audiences, there's generally, you know, they know something's wrong, there's a great yearning, but the tactic of the Zionists is to get the Palestinians sucked into some esoteric debate, like about the Penal Commission of 1934, which Osama Makdisi is guilty of himself, and not do what you say, what I've done in the media, and just kind of like stick to basic knowledge. And yes, I know all this Jabotinsky and all this other kind of stuff, but that's not what I talk about. That's not what I let Zionists drag me into. So I just sort of am chagrined to see that this happens over and over again with these educated Palestinian Americans with PhDs and whatnot. They talk on the level of people in this room, you know, people outside this room.
Thank you.
I see another question for a hand. Oh, I'm sorry, out of my sight, sorry.
No, that's okay. I guess further on the topic of education, as a Gen Zer, I don't know anyone my age that watches TV legacy media. I know people, like, I try and catch up with, like, ground news and all that stuff, but I guess my question is, how do you deal with the fickle and short attention span that comes with social media and bite-sized stuff? I've seen a lot of like shifts from Palestine, and that narrative is changing, especially among my age group. But when like ICE and all that stuff blew up, and now people are talking more domestic, like in this world where we have like bite-size and everything's like fast, how do you keep people's attention, or how do you redirect attention back while knowing that there's other stuff going on? What do you think creators in the US can do to help with that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I will say, I talked to several creators for the book, and they basically told me the different strategies, you know, that they use. And I had a range of perspectives, you know. Some people just said, like, we should get off all of the mainstream social media in general. That was, you know, one perspective. And, you know, given the way that the companies themselves act, it kind of makes sense that people would feel that way. Another perspective, more that I got, and this was from a range of organizations, was, well, we need to meet people where they're at. So we don't necessarily love these things, and we want to also go into other things. But part of it is, you know, you go to where the majority of people are and try and start to spread your messaging. And what they say is precisely that they found that, you know, they definitely post regularly about Palestine, but they also do mix up the things that they post for various reasons. One of it is that, you know, it keeps their audience engaged, and also makes it less likely for them to be shadow banned, frankly, which is something that they struggle with a lot. Because, you know, I talked to people who had huge followings and said, when I just posted about the genocide, I saw my followers were no longer getting access to my posts, and they told me. But I think another aspect of it is just the fact that, you know, the reason you fight for Palestine is because you're fighting a liberation struggle, and so that inherently is an interconnection to many other struggles. And so part of it, I think, is it's also important for us to reiterate, but also keep in mind and actually reassert what are the actual interconnections, to the other struggles. And I think it's kind of a dangerous moment right now, because I think we're seeing those interconnections be drawn for us very directly. But I think that's all the more reason to also think about what are the actual principles of this struggle, and how does that connect me to other things, that I'm also directly involved in, or that I at least advocate for. And I think those things will help, because I think that, more and more nowadays, when we just see this constant barrage of all of this, disaster news, I think part of that, it may not always necessarily be a direct strategy, but the impact is it does make you feel more isolated and despairing and just kind of give up. And so, we need to continue to think about, okay, what are the aspects that connect this struggle to others, to assert those and to show up in spaces in that way, and I think make those things explicit.
Is there a question here?
Thank you so much for your work and for sharing it, Omar. I appreciate how your analysis of settler colonialism also weaves together like techno-capitalism, techno-fascism, and you could say digital imperialism. And I'm curious about how you might try to distinguish between those different nodes at the same time as they're interconnected. And I'm asking that in no small part because when I teach about settler colonialism, I do try to encourage students here to not project the understanding of settler colonialism that they've developed from the American case onto the entire world. I mean, that's not to say that settler colonialism isn't a potent political force. I mean, you see that in the project of Greater Israel, but there are also other processes involved. And so I'm curious about when you might switch the focus to one of those other nodes, just to be as clear as possible about what's happening and why it's happening.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's still something I try to think through, because I think part of the work of the book, and for all of us who do this work in general, is you're trying to provide a framework that is useful for thinking about these issues. I guess one way I would think about it is that part of how I distinguish the nodes is thinking about, when I'm thinking about settler colonialism in the Israeli context, I'm thinking about the Israeli project, I'm thinking about Zionism as a settler colonial endeavor, and that's more or less the constant. But when I'm thinking about different modes of digital politics, I think that's also where things start to shift a little bit. Like, for example, you could think about techno-fascism as a political turn that has led to kind of a change in the caliber of the support for settler colonialism that makes it more readily possible. Whereas I think if you look at the tech movement a few years prior, where there was still kind of more of this liberal facade, this investment in, this fake investment in things like, anti-racism and DEI, and then all of a sudden you see the same companies very willingly leaning in. So that's one way that I think about it, is that some of the nodes can also be capturing particular political cadences, and that could translate into more or less direct, explicit, support for the project of settler colonialism as I'm looking at it.
So one word that I saw that kept coming up was the word of like interconnectedness of struggles, but also primarily of social media allows us to be in connection with people across the globe. But you also talk about like the ambivalence of this, that you can have tens of thousands of posts, if not accounts, just completely erased, and it gets a fraction of the coverage of like Barry Weiss Axing and CPOP stories from CBS, right? And I guess this interconnectedness is also what makes the Palestinian genocide so absurd, in that it's the first live stream genocide in history, and in many cases you can no longer say you didn't know, only that many didn't care. It's not to say that ignorance or unknowingness isn't a factor, but so I was wondering if you could talk more about that absurdity, and that you can have so much interconnectedness, and yet it can somewhat function as a case of, and you also talk about workers in that, it can function as a case of false socialization, in that like we're used to thinking that with higher socialization we have more leverage and collective bargaining, et cetera, and how social media almost, abstracts that or fails to meet that same power.
Yeah, so just to make sure I've caught the question. So you're saying that, can we talk a bit more about how even with this acting on and awareness of interconnection, like does the hypothetical power that you would get from the greater numbers actually, is it really going to translate to something when you have all of these systems that are still stacked against you? That's kind of a simplified way, but is that, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I think that is one of the things that we're seeing is like literally you can have numbers, you can have scale, and yet you could still have things like this intensive, censorship or this banning, or you could have these workers be fired, which did happen and continues to happen. And, I've talked to people who said, well, it's a genocide or my job. And for me, like my job doesn't matter as much, and not, and I understand, we live in this capitalistic society, and different people may not be able to take those positions, right? And so I don't think that it's not necessarily just the numbers that are necessarily going to make things shift, but I do think that we need to continue to struggle as much as we can, because we don't always necessarily know what's going to happen, right? And we do want more and more people to come out and be activated for the Palestinian struggle. And there was something too, I do think what you're describing too about the live stream genocide, there was something to this where there is an element of like, okay, what's going to happen now? Like this is kind of a test, right? This is like a test of humanity. This is a test of ethics globally. Like something needs to happen, right? And we saw like a lot of these actors just lock down even more, right? And I think for me also it was a confirmation, for the university institution. It was a confirmation for the medical industry. When you see the example of Gaza doctors who are sacrificing themselves, they're saying, this is what I was trained to do. I'm gonna stay here. I'm not gonna leave, even if there is a military incursion. And then, meanwhile, the rest of the world or these institutions often don't, even say anything about it. So, all that's to say that I think we need to be the change in the system. And I don't mean we can literally do this individually, but I think we've learned at this moment that no institution is really going to suddenly have a change of heart all on their own and come to advocate for any people's freedom or to save us. People in power, people in different institutions, they're gonna do what's most convenient for them, right? And they're actually capable, we've seen, of minimizing all kinds of horrifying things and saying that they're just doing their jobs. So I think we do need more numbers, we do need more people, to make these important choices and even sacrifices in certain instances, not necessarily because them doing that individually is going to change it, but because we need to create the example that we need, the rest of our society really to take note of. We need to be the people who actually enact that, because I think it's clear what the institutions that are, that basically run our lives stand for, and it's certainly not that.
I think she might have got a question. She had I don't know if she still has a question or not.
I just wanted to ask a really specific question about WhatsApp. If they are complicit in providing information to target the bombing of specific Palestinian homes.
Yes, yeah. So WhatsApp, I know that Paul Begar, who's a co-founder of Tech for Palestine, did a report on this. I think it was maybe 2 years ago now. But basically how WhatsApp, it has been confirmed, shares the metadata for its groups with the Israeli occupation forces. So essentially, this allows them to target individuals, right? Because they look at membership in WhatsApp groups, they see who's represented, and they basically, based on that, decide who are the individuals that we're going to be targeting. So at least the metadata of the groups has been confirmed. So I do know that there is that level of complicity.
Is there a question?
Sure. I had a question about, so you mentioned that you are a professor at SMSU. So I guess back there in campus, SMSU was like the first university to win divestment from weapons manufacturing and a lot of other military intelligence companies with Caterpillar and Stockton, etc. So I guess just to back a little bit. earlier this week, we invited some of the organizers who had one, who were facilitating the given, and one ended up with divestment at the SMSU student union, I believe. And they're also like the organization that's taking up this fight against open AI at your school. And something that I'm curious about is they have like a type of organizing method that is like they organize their departments that are able to 1,000, large numbers of people. We haven't seen, I guess, in other universities, right? Like even in Columbia, even in like here at Berkeley, like it's often like small groups of people or organizers who are kind of trying to mobilize these large groups and not necessarily organizing them. Do you see that kind of model that SFSU has as being the way forward in terms of organizing universities to really propel the fight against genocide, against ICE, against all these different kind of fascist forces?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think you can always do a one-size-fits-all approach in organizing, but I do think that this model of really trying to recruit people in different departments and different sectors at the university is effective. It's because I also think about it from my perspective, like being a professor, where you see that faculty face different levels of precarity, but I think also as a class we can be so bureaucratized that we become very risk averse. So I think there really is something to this model of like building with people and getting them to actually be comfortable and committed, to doing work. Because I think if you just leave it up to people's natural tendencies, you're not necessarily going to get the massive resistance that you could get. Which isn't to say that people aren't opposed to what's happening, but there may be, various forms of reluctance to put themselves on the line or to say things. So if you build with people, I do think building with people always is the best approach, because you need to cultivate like a familiarity and a sense of interconnection with one another and with the cause. So yeah, I do think it's important to think about how do we actually build, with large sectors across different campuses.
That's a question.
I'm wondering, when you're speaking about building an organized mass, especially within tech or within an institution like UC Berkeley, which is so deeply entrenched in a lot of these, genocidal technologies and structures. How do you take the first steps towards organizing people, if the University of California is not going to divest, with the first time we try to organize a group of people, how do you organize people around something that's not necessarily immediately winnable, or something that isn't necessarily going to materially change much, but it's necessary for developing that organization? Yes.
Yeah, that's the thing, because you can vote, have a successful vote for divestment, but then it's one thing to do that and to build a campaign, and it's another to actually have that implemented. But I think part of it is to continue to find different ways of exerting pressure to follow up on things like votes, which I believe was also even the South African case. Votes on campuses didn't necessarily immediately translate to things. People had to continue organizing and doing different forms of demonstrations and protests to, leverage exact pressure basically to make sure that these things were implemented. Because I think, forces like the Regents or, various other bureaucratic academic positions that basically exist to, make sure these systems continue to function, in this top-down anti-democratic way, will kind of hold out till the very, very end. So that said, I don't think that means that things like, passing votes for divestment are not impactful. I think there's also a lot of other value, which is that, first, they are their own education campaigns. This is the way a lot of people become brought over to causes like Palestine, through things like divestment campaigns, which have a heavy educational component. And so in a lot of ways, I think you get gains that are not necessarily only quantifiable by if a resolution passes, leads to divestment, because you've gained so many other things through that process. I think it's always important to do them. But that said, yes, it's true. I think the power is against you, and even with passing something like that, they're not necessarily going to do it, but it's important to just continue to find different actions to, put the pressure on to get them to do that. And part of figuring out what that looks like, I think, is the task of organizing ultimately.
I want to add in a little bit, because I think one of the things that we, at least as workers at Microsoft, is our campaign actually started after No Tech for Apartheid, and we learned from them, which is really important. When you are sort of building a campaign from scratch, or you see this grand task that you can't even think about, you do not have to invent the wheel. You go talk to other organizers, learn from them at the lessons. And I think one of the things that is really important, and our campaign kind of has been lucky, is we, as organizers in the campaign and as workers, we kept laser focused on what is the goal. The goal is not a resolution. The goal is not for the boards of regions, or in our case the executives, to come out and say, actually we are not complicit in genocide, which Microsoft actually did. Microsoft 3 months before their biggest scandal or their biggest revelation was we did our research and we are not involved in Gaza, and then 3 months later they're oh, we store 11 terabytes or 1 million calls an hour. It's not really that the goal is the resolution or the voting, but through the organizing model of being laser focused on divestment and taking steps towards it. And luckily for our campaign, earlier last year, we got our sort of first divestment win with Microsoft sort of removing the surveillance data from their servers and cutting ties with the Israeli Unit 8200. But actually in response, our sort of statement was this is super inadequate. Yes, that means that the pressure works, but that means that this is the time where you have to carry the momentum and continue to put pressure, not giving Microsoft a breather, honestly, right? And more protests, more and more angles of pressure, right? You kind of need to do the analysis of where do you have the most power and where can you put these big machines to a halt, right? And I think that requires a lot of that continuous work of thinking about the methods that others have used and learning from them and applying them and see how the university responds. And sometimes you'd be okay, this tactic the university is not responding to, this tactic actually hit a nerve, this tactic, and so on and so forth. But staying that laser focus on the intermediary steps are important, but there is that big target that you need to maintain the momentum going towards it. Question, and I think I want to be mindful of time, so probably one or two last questions.
I'm from San Jose. My dad and my uncle are tech workers in San Jose. Pretty much everyone I grew up around is an engineer in Silicon Valley. So I guess my question is twofold. First part of it is just, how do you think, and a lot of them also are immigrants, H-1B immigrants. That's how my whole family came here. That's how a lot of the family friends I have came here. So my question is just, first things first, do you see any nexus between that immigrant experience and what's going on in Palestine, and how someone like me can use that to kind of, change the sort of attitude of apathy that I'm seeing with a lot of people that I know in my close circles? And my other question is just for any workers right now who are currently on H-1B visas and are kind of worried about their citizenship status, if they do organize around Palestine, if there's anything that you can see them being able to do for the movement while still being mindful of that.
Yeah, one thing, and I was thinking about this, as you were talking about the different campaigns. One thing that's been helpful, and I understand that not everybody is even able to do this, but one thing that's also helpful is when people become whistleblowers on some level. That's super helpful, and I've talked to several whistleblowers, so that's something that if you feel I can't do anything else, but maybe I'm able to relay some of this information about these developments that I find, I think that still makes a huge difference, because actually everything we find out about tech really is in hindsight a lot of the times. Somebody has leaked something, or it's just eventually people are able to access information that we weren't supposed to get a hold of. So that's one thing. But I think another thing that people can do, even if they don't necessarily feel like they're empowered enough to be directly vocal or active, maybe they could, still talk to, communities of theirs or people that they know, and spread awareness at that level. And I think in terms of, immigrant experiences in Palestine, I'm sure there isn't, again, like a one size fits all way, but I think if people draw connections between, the struggles that they're facing, and then they think about, well, we're working for these industries that in many ways are basically streamlining the ability of this state to exploit these people, it could be one way, a point of access for people to start thinking about it a little bit more. I definitely don't have any kind of definitive answer for any of these things, but those are just some preliminary thoughts.
Yeah, I think also another piece around the worker angle, as someone who's been organizing as a worker, is like, it is also the job of the core organizers to figure out like, how do we create the space where people are able to, independent of the risk tolerance, independent of their capacity, contribute to that larger goal, right? And that means like actually thinking about the kind of tasks that like support the bigger organizing goal, but does not put its organizers at risk. Like, how do you maintain anonymity? How do you like arrange these different things? And like, be honest with yourself of like, not everyone, not just for immigration status, but not everyone is going to be able to take the risk of getting fired, right? There are people who rely on the job to support their family and pay the bills. People who rely on the unfortunate situation where healthcare is tied to a job in the modern day, and people are unable to do that. So like, not just about immigration, but in the broader system of like, let's think about what as an organization we're doing, how can we offer the space for people to organize, and like get people comfortable with organizing. I think organizing sometimes for workers, especially tech workers, looks like this very vague, like what do you mean organize? Like and it took us a lot of time to like actually, come to this town hall, learn about what we do. Hey, we publicize, for example, our work streams, like the things that we do as part of the organization, and say like, these are things that you can do even if you're not within NOAA or No Agenda for Apartheid. So definitely a lot of work of like meeting people where they are. And I think I have seen a lot of like organizers who are H-1B, who are on green card, who are able to contribute meaningfully to the campaign. But like, and this is sort of paradoxical, you will never see them. You'll never hear their name. You'll never know that they were in part of this organizing group. It's just so many of thankless hours because they believe in the cause, but they cannot take the risk of like even being here, being recorded, right? Because of all of the research that comes with it. Okay. In the interest of time, if you have any last words to share with the group before we close us off.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to speak with all of you, and I look forward to talking to some of you afterwards, and happy to be in touch if anybody wants to follow up.
And just one last thing, as y'all might know, like this event is being organized to support mutual aid initiatives. So there is books of terms of servitude that we had been talking about. There are also stickers. So definitely take the time to support a great cause. And yeah, obviously around here to talk to y'all. But thanks everybody for coming. Honored, privileged, and look to be back soon as well to Berkeley campus.
Thank you all.
Thank you.